From studios at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, this is 4th and State. In this edition, Congressman Paul Ryan visits 4th and State for the first time since the November election to talk about the budget, the deficit, and the future of the country. I'm David Haynes. I'm the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Welcome to the special edition of 4th and State. We're joined today by our editorial board, by editors and reporters from the newsroom staff, and by Elizabeth Brenner, our publisher, and by our special guest, Congressman Paul Ryan, the Republican candidate for vice president in the last election, and the House Budget Chairman. Congressman, welcome back to 4th and State.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Dave. Good to be with you.
Glad to have you. Now, in recent days, you and other Republican leaders have been talking a lot about the need for the party to talk differently about the issues. But I'd like to get your reaction to something that President Obama said in his inaugural address. He said, the commitments we make to one another through Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, these things do not sap our initiative. They strengthen us. They do not make us a nation of takers. They free us to take the risks that make our country great. Now, he didn't call you out by name there, but he was referring at least to some of the ideas that you've talked about in the past. Do you really think that people who are on Medicare are takers? Quote,
No,
unquote?
I don't.
Explain that.
That's the point I make when I make these straw man allegations, I guess. Mm-hmm. And when I've cited these statistics in the past, I've always done so to try and calm the concerns that people have that it's too late, we're too much of a dependency culture. Because statistics suggest that more people are net beneficiaries of government than taxpayers. Mm-hmm. And my argument has always been that's just not a good, accurate reflection of where we are in society. A lot of people are out of work, going back to school to get a new skill, to get back at a job. People who paid their taxes, worked and retired, worked for the military, things like that. The point I've been making is it's right to be concerned about a culture that encourages able-bodied people not to reach their potential and to become more dependent, but we are nowhere past what we would consider a tipping point. But we need to be concerned about that. And so to suggest that people like ourselves in Congress are suspicious of taking care of the elderly or feeding poor children or Social Security, which is what the president implied in his press conference before, to me is just the classic straw man argument. Assign views to your opponents they don't have in order to win an argument by default.
Let's talk about Medicare for a minute.
Yeah.
You had a plan.
Just my mom's on Medicare.
Right.
Love my mother, and I do not think of my mother as a taker. Social Security helped me at a pretty tough time in my life to go to college.
Right.
So these are valuable contributions. The point is, if you're complicit, if you don't save these programs, then you're complicit with their bankruptcy. People like me have been offering reform after reform on how to save these programs so that they're sustainable, so you can keep the promise to current seniors as they're currently designed, and then reform it so it's there for my generation when we retire, let alone our kids.
Let's get to your proposal for Medicare. Is that proposal dead at this point after the election?
I don't think
Has
so.
that issue been decided?
First of all, if you talk about politics, we won the senior vote, number one. Number two, these issues have had bipartisan support for a number of years. My bill is supported by a Democrat named Ron Wyden, who's a senator on the Finance Committee and Budget Committee in
Although he backed
Oregon.
off a little bit from that support.
Well, I think in the political campaign, he didn't want to hurt his side politically. Mm-hmm. Ron and I are good friends. We've had good chats. It's no different than the Rivlin-Domenici plan for saving Medicare. Ellis Rivlin, a Democrat, mm-hmm. Pete Domenici, a Republican. And so I think the idea is coming due. And the reason why I think this idea is not dead in the water is because as Obamacare rolls in, as its effects on Medicare are being borne, I believe premium support will compare even more favorably once the results of IPAB, all the provider changes that are coming in take place. You ought to have the Aurora and the Wheaton people come in here mm-hmm. and have them walk you through the future as they see it with this new law kicking in. It's not a pretty future. And I believe our version of reform, premium support, which does not change the benefits for current seniors, I think that version of reform is going to be far more acceptable now that it's being contrasted with the actual results of the president's health care law once it's taking place. The problem is we debated against theory. And the president passed his agenda based on rhetoric and theory, but he hadn't implemented it yet. Now that it's going to be implemented and the results are going to be seen, I really believe our ideas will compare even more favorably.
Well, the Supreme Court has upheld the basic construct of the law. the Democrats won the election. Obamacare is the law of the
And
land.
it will be implemented, I think.
Are
Yeah.
there still ways that some of the consumer-driven competitive approaches that you favored can be injected into the law? Even
I
at this
don't
point?
think so. I still believe that.
So how do you do what you want to do?
Yeah, I still believe that the law is born of such a faulty architecture, such a bad premise, that the way I always saw it, there were three ways Obamacare would be replaced. Either they do it at the court, that didn't happen. Either Mitt and I win the election and we replace it, that didn't happen. Now I think it's going to be the ugly third way, which is the law will collapse under its own weight. I really do not believe that the healthcare system can sustain what is coming due. I don't believe we can sustain all the dumping that will occur from people being dumped out of their employer plans onto the exchanges.
And you think that'll happen?
Absolutely. I really think the provider community can't sustain more payers coming through the door where they get reimbursed less money to provide the services. So injecting a little bit of consumerism within there on that kind of an architecture I don't think works. But this is why I think if we don't agree with the implementation of this law, which we don't because I think it really will hurt healthcare in all of its ways, I believe we owe the country a more specific vision of how do you have a system where everybody can get affordable health care no matter who they are, no matter what their condition is? How do you have a system that saves Medicare from bankruptcy and makes it a viable, sustainable program for the next generations? That's what we owe the country. That's what I've done, and that's what I think we're going to continue to do. And hopefully they'll compare quite favorably to the ugly results that I think will start befalling the country once this gets implemented.
Don Walker.
I'm
Congressman,
not going to get a chance to get through any of these.
Oh,
You might.
I'm sure we will. We have some questions on that, actually.
In the last few days, you've given a string of interviews to a number of people, including Craig of the Washington Bureau, and you talked a fair amount about the Republican Party needing to be a little more judicious, sort of pick your fights, things that you feel you can advance your agenda on. At approximately the same time that you were giving those interviews, the Speaker of the House was saying in Washington that abortion needs to be a national priority for his party. My question is, you're behind the personhood legislation. Is abortion a priority for your party?
Well, I've co-sponsored that legislation, I think, probably every year I've been in Congress. That doesn't mean we're going to change our positions on critical issues. I mean, I don't think that's what people are asking for. And I don't think that's what we're suggesting we're going to do, that we're going to violate core, deeply held principles. The point I've been making is we need to show that we have better solutions for fixing real anxieties that people have in their lives. You know, I'm going to spend a lot of my time trying to come up with ideas that really do fight poverty. I think we've lost the war on poverty. I think the statistics bear that out. We need to fix that. I think we have a debt crisis coming. We need to be really clear about that and come up with a plan to prevent that from happening. You know, we need to show how we can fix schools, which is a big part of fighting poverty. And I think we have better ideas on all of that, including job training. People who are stuck in the middle part of their lives, in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, out of jobs, which is a common problem we have here. How do you get those people back on a track of getting a good career? Those are the kinds of things that I've been talking about that we have to do. But that doesn't mean to say we're all of a sudden going to violate core principles we have. And by the way, we have a lot of pro-choice people in our party. You know, Mark Kirk is a very good friend of mine who's returning back to work, a well-known pro-choice Republican. You know, Scott Brown, he lost his election. He hopefully will run again. We'll all support him if he does, a well-known pro-choice Republican. Look, the way I look at this is we don't have a 19-point litmus test you have to satisfy before we want to let you in our party. If you believe on the core idea of this country, you know, equality of opportunity, liberty and freedom, self-determination, free enterprise, then rally around that tallest pole in our big tent, and then we'll agree to disagree on these other issues. And we want you in the party whether we agree on these issues or not. That's the way I think a majority party ought to conduct itself, whether it's the Democrat Party or the Republican Party.
But would abortion continue to be a priority for you this year?
Well, I've always co-sponsored this legislation, and when this legislation comes up for a vote, I'll vote the way I always have.
But, I mean, the head of the House of
Yeah, but
Representatives...
I'm not the sponsor of this
is saying-
legislation. I'm a co-sponsor with I don't know, hundreds of other people, as I always have been. If you see...
But Speaker Boehner wants this a priority. He's
I don't-
obviously
Yeah, I don't know.
calling you-
I haven't talked to John about that, so I can't speak to that. And I'm not even familiar with the interview you're talking about, to be honest with you. But if you see where people lead and what they're focusing their efforts on, that's the legislation that they write and they themselves introduce. What am I working on? I'm working on preventing a budget crisis right now. The speeches I'm giving, like the one I gave at the Kemp Foundation, I want to come up with an agenda to fight poverty. Those are the things that I am personally working on, and there are many other issues that other people are going to champion. These are the ones I'm going to champion.
You talked about the Big Ten, and that's something that Ronald Reagan, of course, talked about. But
And Ronald Reagan, no one questioned his credentials on these issues.
But in recent years, after the advent of the Tea Party, Republicans have run scared at times in primary elections. They've been afraid of challenges from their right.
Yeah, I think
how is that a Big Ten?
I think
Has that changed?
there's something to that, but what does Tea Party stand for? Taxed enough already. This is an economic conservative movement. This is not a social conservative movement. If you go to meet with Tea Party people, a lot of them are libertarians, meaning they don't have social conservative views. And so I would argue that the core tenet of our party from political issues, policies, are the economic conservatism, fiscal responsibility. Those are things that we all unify around. But there are other issues that we may not all agree on. Immigration is going to be one of those issues, I think. Some of us, will disagree with each other on how to fix immigration. Fine. But on fiscal conservatism, that's something which is what the Tea Party has helped bring to the table. We all agree on. With respect to the Tea Party, I think they were sick of Republicans, running as fiscal conservatives and not acting as fiscal conservatives in office. I think that's really what that movement's all about.
Let's talk about immigration for a second. Ernie Franzen, there's a new deal out there, a new proposal out there this morning from a key group of senators.
I haven't even read it yet, so I don't know. Some of them are good friends of mine. I've talked to them over the last number of days and weeks. Jeff Flake, Marco Rubio. I co-sponsored Flake's bill in 2005, 2004, which was sort of the House version of McCain-Kennedy, which was back then. I've seen the principles that Marco has put out. I endorsed those. I put a statement out.
What to you would be good immigration reform?
Yeah, so I heard about this driving up here, so I haven't had a chance to read those principles. I'm also working with a group of Democrats and Republicans in the House in a similar vein. You've got to have border security. You've got to have a good employer verification system. But you have to have an employer verification system to get at the issue of identity theft. But you have to do that in a way that is sensitive to the fact that Hispanics' surnames are the people who are the primary victims of identity theft. Mm-hmm. You have to get that one right, meaning you don't want to have a system that makes it harder for a person to get a job. So you have to have a system that makes it sure that people can reclaim their identities. So border, employer verification, then you have all these various visa issues. Guest workers, STEM, or what we call H-1B visas, skilled, unskilled, seasonal. Then the thornier issue of the 11, let's just say it's 11 million. Nobody knows the number of undocumented. I think the Rubio principle, which I believe this group was advancing as well, of earned legalization, where you maintain the balance between respecting the rule of law and being realistic about how to handle this population in a respectful way is earned legalization. You're not going to get rewarded for cutting in line against another immigrant who played by the rules. You have to, pay back taxes. You got to make sure you don't have a felony on your record, and you can get temporary work visas to maintain employment. And if you want to, a lot of folks aren't looking for citizenship. They're just looking for work permits. And if you want to become a citizen, then you have to go through that normal process that everybody else does at the back of the line behind those who've done everything legally up till now. So that kind of a system, how you do that, the devil's in the details, so they say. How you do that is something we're going to have to debate and compromise on. But I think that generally is it. Now the question always becomes, well, are you going to do one big bill, or are you going to break it up in pieces? Right. Now, my personal view from a legislative tactical standpoint is pieces works better. I did, as a staffer, I worked on the 96 bill, and I actually helped write an amendment to defeat closing down family immigration. It was a Brownback amendment. I worked on Jack Kemp's anti-Prop 187 stuff when I was a staffer. I worked on this issue a long time, and I've watched these big efforts come where they have this comprehensive bill that they bring to the floor, and when you make a big comprehensive bill, too many members have too many problems with too many various provisions, and it collapses under its own weight. If you do separate, you have different vote coalitions, so let's take this bill in 5 pieces, let's say. you'll have 5 different vote coalitions getting it through and passing it at the end of the day. But for bipartisanship, for getting a good agreement, you have to be honest with each other and make commitments that all of these pieces will come up. And that's what I think some people are concerned about is, oh, you Republicans, you'll just move these things you like, but you won't move this other thing.
Right.
You just have to have that commitment there in order to get it done.
Is it doable this year?
Yeah, I think, and look, I've been wanting to do this since '04 or '05, so I personally believe we should have done this a long time ago. I really do believe it's doable this year.
What would be the first bill you'd like to see?
Well, I think they should come together in the same week.
Okay.
So I think for the sake of keeping this issue together and keeping a bipartisan coalition together, you have to have a commitment that they're all going to come up. So you could bring one big comprehensive bill. I'm not opposed to that. I just worry that might not be as effective from a legislative passage standpoint than pieces. But if you're going to bring pieces, bring them all at the same time. Literally one after the other.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get back to fiscal issues for a minute. Are we in a debt crisis?
Not yet, but we're getting there.
What makes you say that? Paul Krugman and others on the left would argue we don't need less spending.
Yeah, I know they say that a lot. Yeah, I think that
and you argue spending's the problem.
I think that is the problem. Can I do some charts then?
You can. we would love to see the chart.
Some charts.
I can go through a lot. Maybe I'll just do the one I did the other day. I'll spare you of 7. Maybe go to 1 unless you want to get into this.
No, that's perfect.
So can you see? This works for you? So some on the left, and by the way, a lot of economists, left and right, are suggesting, of course we have a debt crisis. It's a spending-driven debt crisis. Most people wouldn't argue with that, I don't think. The green shows you our historic revenues as a share of our economy. The blue are the additional revenues that President Obama has called for, all the various tax increases that he's endorsed. He's gotten a lot of these already. I mean, the fiscal cliff, he got a big chunk of that already. Mm-hmm. Even if he got everything he'd asked for in higher revenues, it pales in comparison, doesn't even come close to paying for the spending path that we are on. And so this is something that we have to deal with. We've got 10,000 people retiring every single day in America today.
Isn't most of that Medicare, though?
Well, Social Security, Medicare, but the next sentence I was going to say before you is, and the benefits they consume grow at least twice the rate of inflation or the economy. 6% growth we're talking about. So that is a big issue. We have to deal with that. And the sooner we deal with that, the sooner we do it on our own terms as a country. The whole point that Mitt and I were making about Medicare reforms is the sooner we act, the more people we can prevent from having any kind of change or disruption in their lives. But the more you delay, such as Europe, the more severe and sudden the changes must become. That's what happens in a debt crisis. So to those who say this that we're talking about is austerity, it's literally the opposite. What we're saying is we want to prevent austerity, preempt austerity, because austerity is the bond markets have turned on you, interest rates have shot up, your interest payments have gone from $200 billion a year to $600 or $700 billion a year, and you're literally losing control of your own fiscal situation of your budget. The Federal Reserve's least bad option is just to monetize more, which debases your currency.
Well, what's the evidence
And
that
so-
there are signs of that occurring now, or that we should be worried about? Again, those on the left would argue
The evidence
no
of the
evidence
signs-
of that at this point.
The evidence of the signs are,
They call you a bond vigilante. They call you a debt skull.
that's fine. The evidence of the signs, let me go to another chart. The second chart.
There you go, 2.
The evidence, I'm fitting 2
You're
in.
allowed at least.
And then I won't talk about what our budget did. The evidence of the sign is, this is CBO's projection of our budget. Name me a nation that has survived this kind of a debt path. You can't. Rogoff and Reinhardt, 2 well-known, esteemed economists, not right-wing, types, have said that once your debt reaches about 90% of GDP, you really start slowing down your economy. And you get much farther above that, you have a real problem. Great nations can't afford these kinds of debt crises. So the evidence is the path we are on. Our debt to GDP ratio gets to about 800% of GDP by the end of the century under some of these scenarios when, our grandkids are supposed to be enjoying their American dream. The point is, we are denying our kids a good future if we stay on this path. I don't know how a person can refute that. And so to suggest that we just need to do more spending means we're going to do more borrowing. And we're getting to borrowing levels that, because we're a world reserve currency, we've bought ourselves time. Because We're a little healthier looking than some of the other first world countries that are in this mess. And so therefore, relative, we're a safe haven. That buys us time. Let's use that time to fix this thing before we're in a European type of a crisis. When does that happen? Nobody knows the answer.
The critics would say it's a short-term, long-term problem. They would say short-term, more spending, longer-term, yes, we have to fix
Well, that's
that
where I
problem.
disagree with Keynesian stimulus. I disagree with Keynesian demand-side stimulus. I don't think that that's effective. I don't think it works extremely well at all. I think marginal rates makes more of a difference. I think short-term sugar-high economics can give you a pop in a quarter or two, but it doesn't give you better expectations, so people will take risks and go borrow capital and hire people and make commitments that actually end up growing the economy or lead to higher productivity, which leads to more innovation and higher living standards. We're stagnating. We're excited about 2% growth. We should be growing above 3%, especially coming out of the kind of recession we have. We need to have faster pro-growth policies in place, which we think is tax reform, regulatory reform, sound money, fiscal discipline, showing that we're getting the country's finances under control. And if we did that, which was our plan had we been elected, we really think we would have had very good growth.
Let's talk about tax reform for a moment. Democrats, Chuck Schumer last week said we want more revenues. You've said they got their revenues.
That's right.
So we're sort of back as laymen looking at this to the old more taxes, no more taxes debate. How do you get past that, and what does tax reform look like?
Well, we've always said tax reform looks like lower rates with broader base.
Are you talking about individual or corporate?
Both,
or
both. Both are the same thing. I've been on Ways and Means for, it's my 13th year now. Both sides of the code have full of stuff for narrow interests. Some broad interests, lots of narrow interests. What it is you send your money to Washington, and then if you engage in behavior that Washington approves of, they'll give you some of your money back. I think smarter economic policy says stop picking winners and losers in the tax code based on who has more access to policymakers and special interests, and just let people and businesses keep more of their money in the first place and lower rates. Now, there's another component that's unique to this time. The 21st century, tax competition matters because capital is so much more mobile. It can move cross borders so much more than it ever could before. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that our tax rates are the highest in the world. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. And with what just happened at the beginning of this month, our pass-throughs, our small businesses, sub-S's, LLCs, partnerships, which is very unique to America. Most other countries don't tax businesses like that. Their top tax rate's higher than a corporate tax rate now. And so it makes it very hard for us to compete globally. Canadians lowered the tax rate on every one of their businesses to 15% last January. We raised ours from at least 35 to as high as 45, approximately, about 44.8 when you factor it all out. That is a growth killer. So we believe, have revenue neutral tax reform. And if you go with the Schumer plan and keep raising revenues, I don't know that you can actually get a good lower rate system if you keep hitting higher revenue targets. One of the reasons why I supported the fiscal cliff compromise was I thought that it gave us a revenue baseline that made it still possible for us to get a nice tax code where we actually got lower rates with a broader base on a revenue neutral basis. You keep raising that much more, and tax reform looks like broader base, higher rates, and that's bad for growth. And that's the difference here. I think the president sees tax reform as just nothing but a revenue generator with higher tax rates. We see tax reform as a growth generator, pro-growth policies, but you got to get your rates down in order to do that.
Congressman, where is your chart showing how you're going to balance the budget in 10 years without raising taxes?
Let me come back in April and I'll show it to you. I haven't written the budget yet. I don't have a baseline to write it yet.
How is it possible? How do you run a country like this so large on the cheap? I mean, that's basically...
On the cheap?
Well, you're not going to raise revenues. How can you do that?
So, are you suggesting we should just follow this?
I'm not suggesting you follow that, but how are you going to do it? How are you going to pay for the military? How are you going to pay for
I get to throw a third chart in here then, right?
Yeah, you do.
So, so forget about the top here. I was going to get into the sequester if you wanted to get into it. This just shows you our projection of current spending. Current spending, it slowed basically when we got the majority and we had divided government for a couple of years. And even if the sequester kicks in, it slows briefly and then it takes off again. This is what we got to deal with. And if we keep trying to chase much faster spending with just higher revenues, we'll shut down our economy. And by the way, just mathematically, we'll never catch up. And so on the cheap, I really highly doubt you would characterize the size of government we have
What are
right
you
now, a
gonna
cheap
cut?
one.
What are you gonna cut?
So that's what we will show you when we put out our
What
budget.
are you gonna cut? I mean, you talk about,
You-
you say you're not.
I have put out
revenue.
specifics every single year. Just don't, let me finish my statements before you interrupt, if you don't mind. I have put out budgets with great specificity each and every single year. So I think I ought to be afforded a little credibility. I'm talking about, I'm going to present a plan and show you what it is. I've done that every year. I haven't written this one yet. Haven't even gotten the baseline from the Correctional Budget Office with which to write it yet. Haven't even sat down with a table like this with my committee members to go through the decisions you have to make on deciding what to do to write it yet. So when I have a budget, which is due April 15th, I'll show you what it is. I'll show the whole country. One of the reasons why we did this recent debt ceiling extension is because we think we need to have that debate. We think we need to answer your questions. What is our budget? What is our priority? How are we going to do this? The Senate hasn't done it for 4 years. So we've had this one-way conversation. House Republicans have put out our budget plans for the world to see how we would do this. What would we cut? What would we reform? What would we do on taxes? We're going to do it again. And the Senate hasn't done it for 4 years. And we don't think you get to a good debate until they put their plans on the table, you put yours, then you can start having a really honest conversation.
Don't you get discouraged? I mean, you've been putting
Yeah.
together plans for a long time.
Yes.
50% of the American population has not bought into your plans. Congress has not bought into your plans. And if I remember correctly, the nominee for the Republican Party didn't promote your plan very much during the last election.
Well, I would disagree with that
Your
last
roadmap-
statement.
Your roadmap was nowhere to be seen, and he did not run on the plan.
I did a lot of town halls on these plans. I don't know if you ever went.
Do you see a ground?
I mean, Craig was on the road with us a bit. I went and I did town hall meetings in Florida, all around the country on these plans. I was using a Jumbotron in stadiums, going through my Medicare plans, talking about how this thing. So we did run on these ideas. So I would differ with we didn't run on these plans. I mean, the man put me on the ticket, for heaven's sake. So
Right.
we didn't run away from these ideas. But Dan, to your point, yeah, it's discouraging. I feel like Sisyphus sometimes, just pushing the rock up the hill, watching it come down. But in my own conscience, if you believe the country is heading toward a very ugly moment, a debt crisis, and you see that coming, which believe I've seen for a while, I don't know exactly when, but these fundamentals are so wrong, it's going to hurt everybody. You have to do everything you can to prevent that from
Now,
happening.
you did say you expect the Obamacare plan to collapse under its own weight.
I do.
That's an easy thing to say. It's a little tougher to say how soon. How soon do you expect it to collapse?
I think.
We're talking a year.
Yeah,
2 years?
I would go with Rick Foster's analysis, who was the chief actuary at CMS until he just retired like a week or two ago. And if you look at Rick's analysis, he gives you an analysis of years, not 1 year, 2 years. He gives you an analysis of when you put in all the provider changes, and then you throw an iPad with its spending cut targets on top of it. He gives you projections about how many will go out of business, providers I'm talking about. What the projections are on what providers will get. They'll get 80 cents on the dollar in Medicare, going down over the course of a decade or two to like 30 cents on the dollar. So if you're familiar with Medicaid, you guys have done a lot of reporting on Medicaid. If you're familiar with how when a Medicaid patient walks in the door, they basically are a coster to the provider. Medicare, according to the actuaries, will become like that. And that means the provider network more or less collapses and just can't keep bearing the burden. And what the CMS actuaries projections show you is kind of how that is. I personally think it might be a little faster than that because I believe the estimates on Obamacare underestimate how many people will be dumped from their employer-sponsored health care into the exchanges, which will underpay as well.
So when is a crisis? In 5 years, 10 years?
I don't know the answer to that. I've had a bunch of hearings. I want to know the answer to that. I know you do too. We have economists, fixed income people come in and tell us, single digits, they always tell us 2 to 4 years. It really is depending on exogenous shocks that we just don't anticipate. What happens to Europe? What happens to the economy? Things that are outside of our knowledge and control could trigger a bond market event that could give us this kind of a crisis. The problem is once we have a bond market crisis, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. That's the problem. And so I think with this kind of debt we're racking up, with these kinds of deficits, we're running out of our wiggle room. We're running out of our buffers, our capital buffers to respond. 2008, we needed capital buffers to respond. We did. It raised a lot of debt. We don't really have that anymore. And so that's my big concern is we're blowing through our seed corn, our reserve money we need to respond to any crises, because if we have another event, it's going to be much uglier. And I believe, as your representative, well, I don't know where you live, but as a representative of this state and people who elected me to serve them, I feel it's my duty to try and stop that from happening and get us prepared. And that's why I'm doing this.
Back on the tax reform issue again, though, you talked a lot about, as you described it, revenue neutral. Democrats would say we can use tax reform actually by closing loopholes, raise a little more
Yeah,
revenue.
we agreed to that.
Would you
So, but
be-
we're past that now. The point is, we agreed to that. I signed the letter with John Boehner and.
But on tax reform, if it's possible again this year, would you be okay with higher revenues as a result of tax reform?
We said yes to that, and those higher revenues came in now. So now we're saying we'll hit those targets, which are, what is the date? 20. Yeah, it's my birthday tomorrow.
Happy birthday.
Hey, thanks, appreciate it. A month ago, that revenue spike occurred, $650 billion in higher revenues. We said we would do that and through tax reform. So that has happened now. Now we will write tax reform to hit this new higher revenue level we've now achieved. I even voted for the thing. So that's what I mean. But if you go with this idea of put spending cuts off, higher revenues, a couple of lessons. Number one, that never happens. You just feed more spending. You just take more from people so Washington can spend more. So I think there's a lesson to be learned there, and experience I think gives you that. But the second point is, from the revenue baseline standpoint, having written a lot of tax bills and run a lot of numbers, you can't get a good-looking tax code with a much higher revenue line. So I think we're at that point where I would struggle to say we'll have a good tax code that we can pass to get us a pro-growth. This is where I say there's a difference I think. Now, not all Democrats are like this, I think. There are a lot of Democrats who are friends of mine who agree we need lower rates. But I think the president's version of tax reform is higher rates and a broader base. Mm-hmm. As a revenue generator, we see tax reform as a growth generator.
As a percent of GDP, 18%, 19%?
No, the baseline gets us, well, we'll find out in February. The baseline gets us to 19-something percent of GDP. Mm-hmm. So we're already blowing past 18. I don't know what the number is going to be, but I'm pretty confident it's going to be in the 19 category.
What's going to happen as the next debt ceiling deadline approaches?
So,
Sure.
Max was 3.
man, you're setting me up.
Fourth chart.
I do feel like I'm in a meeting with Doug Wendorf when I sit here talking about this with you all the time. This is very strange. All right. So the events have been sort of resequenced, I guess I would say, because of this short-term extension. And I would be shocked if the Senate doesn't pass what we passed. They would basically be acknowledging they're not going to budget for a 5th year. I mean, I just don't think they're going to do that. I think they've realized they can't keep ignoring their job and the law and not budgeting. So assuming they're going to pass this short-term extension, let's just assume that. And I think that's a safe assumption. You've got the president's budget submission, which is usually the first Monday in February. He's going to blow through that. We don't know when he's going to do that. Normally, the way the law works is then the CBO reestimates his budget, and then you use that as your baseline to write your budget. And you have to wait for his budget before you can write your budget. Mm-hmm. But since we don't even know when, he doesn't have an OMB director, he's an acting guy, and the acting guy doesn't know when they're going to do it. So on that deadline, CBO is just going to give us a new baseline, and I'm probably just going to end up budgeting off of that. That's an aside. The sequester hits March 1. The continuing resolution expires March 27. The budget deadline, this is the law, is April 15th. Then the debt limit on the short term, it's always kind of a guess, is we put a date certain.
Will the sequester
May
cuts
19th.
take effect in your
I
opinion?
think they will. I said this yesterday. The reason I think they will is our partners on the other side of the aisle have refused any of the alternatives to replace it with. We passed, I got 6 committees, I gave them instructions, we call it reconciliation. I put together a spending cut package, passed it twice to pay for the sequester, but they've been rejected by the Senate. And so since they have offered no alternative, my guess is that it is going to happen.
What's the effect on the government?
Uh-oh.
You get one more.
I get one more. So discretionary spending, the total impact on spending is not that much. It flattens for a couple of years, then it goes back up. Defense, we estimate, and these numbers are still being worked on. We estimate defense spending will go down by 7%, and non-defense discretionary spending will go down by 5%. Mandatory spending doesn't bear much of a brunt of this. There are limits to how much.
So
that
read
can
the
get cut.
politics of this.
So,
Is this something that if the sequester takes effect and these mandatory spending cuts take effect?
it's about an $85 billion cut this year, this fiscal year.
Do you envision that sort of happening and then the Congress saying, whoops, we didn't mean it?
I think it will happen. Then you get to the March 20th. So this is what David Gregory was saying. Well, are you going to have a government shutdown then?
Right.
I don't think we're going to, at least it's not our goal to have a government shutdown, because what we'll do is we'll just extend the date of the continuing resolution out at these lower levels. So discretionary spending, I know it's probably not good for TV, but I get into the numbers. We go from 1047 down to 974. And we'll probably carry the 974 out. And that will get that savings that is approximately the $85 billion. We don't like the way that those savings are arrived at, because we think it's clumsy. We don't like what it does to defense, but we're not going to just remove any tool of the only tool of fiscal discipline we have around. We would prefer to replace those cuts with others. I've shown and passed legislation on how to do that, but it's been a one-way conversation. So my guess is, absent a turn of events or a change in behavior that we haven't seen, it will happen. And then we'll have to have an agreement between now and the debt limit where we've showcased our budgets on how to get a down payment. My goal is to show how you can balance the budget within a decade. Our goal in this exchange was fairly well articulated by the speaker, which is to get an agreement that puts us on this path of balancing the budget within a decade. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have one big package that is our budget taken to the highway or the lowway, but get a package of cuts and reforms for $1 of debt limit increase that gets us on this path. So we'll get it in the installment plan, I guess, is the way I would describe it.
How long of a extension of the debt ceiling do you envision?
This goes to May 19th.
Right. So why lurch from crisis to crisis? To the layman, that looks like
Right.
dysfunction.
Exactly, and the reason is we have no budget. See, if you have budgets passed, then all these targets are hit. You don't have these deadlines. You have agreement on these spending targets. But if you're not budgeting, which we haven't for 4 years, you go to crisis to crisis. This is one of the reasons why we're saying, let's go back to, the term of art we use is regular order. We pass our budgets, you guys pass your budgets, let's figure out how to reconcile this thing and then get back to budgeting for the federal government. Because if you actually have a budget, then you don't have these crises.
You've said that President Obama is more interested in political conquest than
I think he
political
is.
compromise.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So,
What,
I don't know the answer to that
specifically,
question.
what has
So-
he done that makes you think that?
I get the impression, based upon his actions and his rhetoric, the straw man stuff we were talking about, that he's more interested in delegitimizing the GOP, so that the last 2 years of his presidency look like the first 2 years of his presidency, where he has basically unfettered control. Now, I believe he thinks that that's the right thing, and I believe he believes that his vision of transforming the country into more of a progressive vision is good. I'm not impugning his motives here. I think he thinks that's the right thing, but the impression I get, I wanted to watch, I made a choice, other than talking to Craig and, Kenosha News and the James Gazette and the Racine Journal-Times, between the election and the inauguration, I was just going to stay silent. And I wanted to, for two reasons. Number one, I thought it was just good manners. Number two, I wanted to see what kind of administration this would be like. Now, reactionaries would say he's just like he was before the election, and wishful thinkers would say, no, he was partisan and divisive for the sake of getting reelected. He'll then become more moderate and solve these problems after the election. And I wanted to see which one of those two scenarios played out. And my read of the situation, based upon his conduct, what he says to our leaders in private, if he talks to them, and his speeches are, no, he's like he was before the election. And he's more interested in partisan conquest than bipartisan compromise, so that he can do what he thinks is right, which is have the last 2 years of his administration look like the first 2 years. I don't see anything that leads me to conclude otherwise.
Is your party behaving any differently?
Well, that's what we're cut out for us. That's what I gave a speech on Saturday saying we need to be prudent. And by the way, prudence is a virtue.
Right.
We need to be smart in how we conduct ourselves. We need to give the country a more clear vision about how we solve the problems of the day. And that's where I think we have our work cut out for us, is communicating effectively how we have better solutions.
Well, let's talk about that. There's been a lot of second thinking and what can we do to move forward. Ryan Priebus was talking about this. What do you see the party needs to do, or a thing that the party needs to do to reach out to minority voters,
Yeah.
Hispanic voters?
Well, I've always believed we need to fix the immigration issue because it's hard for new immigrants or second-generation immigrants to get past that issue. It's a very important issue. And then to see the ideas we have for economic growth, for upward mobility, for entrepreneurship, for families. And I think we need to settle some of these things so that we can talk about those issues. The other thing is, I believe the vast majority of people in this country believe in what we call the American idea. A country striving for equality of opportunity. Not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. And we have to have policies that promote equal opportunity so everybody can make the most of their lives. That to me means a more effective way at fighting poverty, at fixing our schools. And this isn't all federal. I mean, a lot of this is state and local. Fixing our schools, getting our fiscal situation under control, growing the economy, those kinds of things. And I believe that the perception of our party is far from where it needs to be or where it really
So is that a
is
message
on these
problem?
issues.
I mean, are
It's
you
message
not-
and policies.
Are you not getting to African American voters because you're not sending the right message, or you're not sending the message the right way?
I'd say it's both. I think we need to do a better job of promoting policies of upward mobility, of social mobility, of attacking the root causes of poverty. The big issue about civil society, I'm very, very worried about the growth of government crowding out civil society. What I mean by that is our community organizations that are the fiber that glues people together in solidarity, which is those mediating institutions between the person and their government that helps fix problems in our communities. When we grow government too much, when we take too much out of people's paychecks, when we borrow against the next generation, we displace those vibrant organizations from taking seed and actually making a difference. We need to talk to that, and we don't. We're too much, the problem is we look like this all the time. We're throwing charts and graphs and statistics, and I'm guilty as well. I get that, and I think that's part of.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about gun violence. Recently, a relatively small group of Catholic priests, scholars, academics, etc., sent a letter to the Vatican saying if this church is going to be behind ending abortion, it too has to be behind some measures that would cut gun violence. This group specifically mentioned you. It's well known you're a Catholic. It's well known that you're a strong supporter of the NRA. What do you
I'm a
say
strong
to
supporter of the
that?
Second Amendment, I would say.
Well, but you've gotten a
I
very
haven't seen
high
this letter, by
grade
the way.
from the NRA for years of voting. What do you say to those Catholics? You're one yourself. Are there some gun violent measures that you can back?
Yeah, so I can't speak to the letter because I'll have to get a copy of it. I literally haven't seen this yet. Believe it or not, I don't see all the criticisms that come my way. There's just too many to count.
Neither do we.
Yeah, I mean, really, I don't. Life would just, I wouldn't be able to. So, this gets deeper. If you're asking me through a Catholic thinking, Catholic social teaching way, or a policy thing.
Catholic social teaching.
So Catholic social teaching. Okay, so Catholic social teaching to me, this gets deeper than, gun policies. How do background checks work? Are people slipping through the cracks? That's a really good, important question we need to dig into and have hearings on. But Catholic social teaching tells me we got to go deeper than this. We've got to go into the issues of culture. We've got to go into the issues of why are we seeing these episodes of evil prop up throughout all of our communities. We've got to go and have a more comprehensive policy with respect to mental illness to be able to identify early and act early. And when I look at Catholic social teaching, I think a lot of the doctrine from both sides, the Catholic left side and the Catholic right side, if you want to say that, I don't think that's an appropriate term to use actually, from Catholics of various political philosophies, which the Catholic Church has people from various political philosophies. I think both sides miss each other sometimes. We have the principle of solidarity, a very important principle. People living in community with one another, helping each other. You also have the principle of subsidiarity. That means, for lack of a better word, government and actions governing closest to the people doing the best. Bringing it down to local control. You have the preferential option for the poor. I see all of these principles having to be tethered to one another, relating to one another, connected to one another. Because sometimes doctrine sees solidarity without subsidiarity, which means rank materialism and just big government, Or some see only subsidiarity without solidarity, and that's rank individualism. It's somewhere in between. And what that tells me is civil society is really important. Creating the space and the breathing room for people to have the time, the money, and the culture that reinforces working together, civil society. Alexis de Tocqueville, his book is probably the best book on this subject, which is people living in their communities with one another, showing that, through guilds and associations and religious groups and churches and charities, taking care of each other. There's no substitute for that. And to me, that has to be more encouraged. And you also have to speak out for what, lack of better words, is the purge of the scourge of moral relativism. We have to take on the notion, I'm talking not as a congressman or as a federal official, I'm talking as a dad, as a citizen. We have to take on the notion that relatives are moral. There are absolute truths. There are right and wrong, and we need to teach our kids these things. Now, I'm in sort of a preaching phase here. This is not what the government does. That's not the government's job. But as a society, as a Catholic, each and every one of us have a job to do on this front. And so to me, those are deeper issues. Those are deeper issues that speak to why are people resorting to this kind of violence. So, you can talk about cosmetic changes to, gun laws, but why do we have people grabbing a gun and doing this in the first place?
Well, that's a reasonable answer, but now take your
thank you.
hat off for the social teaching and put your legislator hat on. What
All
can
right.
you support?
Make it more specific.
Yeah, so
Are you okay with a gun show in Janesville selling guns to people
without a background check. Yeah, so that's an area I think we need to look into.
Are you okay?
No, I think we should look into is someone who is not legally allowed to buy a gun going to buying one. And let's figure that out. I think we need to find out how to close these loopholes and do it in such a way that we don't infringe upon people's Second Amendment rights. So where's that? Well, I don't know the answer to how to make this work. That's what committee hearings are about. That's what you don't react. You actually dig in and you figure it out. We had this issue 2001, 1999, I think, pop up. This popped up when I first got into Congress. And at the time, I remember thinking, there is a loophole here, and I think we should address that. I remember thinking this back when, I think I talked to a guy named Bob Pucci, the guy who has those radio ads with the dog. Yeah, I haven't
explained this to him.
Yeah, so I remember talking to that guy. This is like 10, 12 years ago. Rocco. Yeah, you hear him on the radio. I remember talking to him about this. He's like, well, couldn't you run these things? And I don't know the guy, and I can't speak for him, but I remember thinking there is an area in which you can make this work. So those things, to me, reasonable dialogue can occur and should occur, and let's figure out how to do that. Now, I think there are other areas, where you don't want to recycle failed policies of the past, like an assault weapons ban. That, to me, didn't stop gun violence. I don't see that as an effective tool, and so I think we don't want to let a moment like this pass where we look at these deeper issues that you talked about, because I think that's the core of it. Let's not forget the core and just go to the cosmetics.
It sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing to look. Yeah.
The question is, can you close a loophole that at least requires any weapon sold in a gun show?
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable. I think that's a very reasonable problem. I think that's obvious, and I think we should look into how to do that.
The extended clips.
I see that as more of a cosmetic thing. I don't see the effectiveness of that. I won't get into how this works, and I obviously am very familiar with.
Guns than we.
Yeah, I have a lot of guns. I'm a big hunter. I've been shooting guns since I was a kid. I'm very familiar with how these weapons operate, with how semi-automatics operate. I think you're getting to the point where you're making changes in law that won't make a difference, and you're compromising people's Second Amendment rights.
So why is it that you think an assault weapons ban wouldn't work? Explain that.
What didn't last time we did it. And more importantly, there are legitimate reasons for citizens to own these weapons, whether it's for hunting, and people do use these for hunting, whether it's for target shooting or self-defense. There are legitimate reasons for people owning these guns.
But when you look at the recent school shootings and the theater shooting and things like that, doesn't that give you time to pause and say,
we got 310 million guns in this country.
I
You really
understand-
think we're gonna?
I understand that, but you know,
Stop these
the guy
guns
didn't go
from-
in there with a 22 and just said pop, pop, pop. He went in there with his, you know, with an assault weapon. So doesn't that give you any kind of reason to say, wait a second, it didn't work last time because of X?
We still had Columbine during that time. The point I'm saying is, why did the kid do that? What's wrong with our culture, or what's wrong with our system where a person who's clearly mentally ill missed all the checks to get him the help he needed to prevent that from happening? So when I see, oh, just ban this, which I really don't think will make a difference.
But everybody,
And
uses those-
we're hopscotching. The real problem here is, why did this kid do this? And what do we do to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen
everybody
again?
that's killing people, they're not all mentally ill. So we can't just say,
Well,
let's look at
and
mental
evil
illness
does
and
occur
fix
in
it.
society, and I don't know that these cosmetic law changes would change that fact. And I do believe, look, I believe the Second Amendment is an individual right. And you have to be very mindful of infringing upon people's individual rights.
Do you have any thoughts on the mental illness question
Yeah, you know,
about identifying people who?
I want to learn.
prevent them
No, I
from
need to.
getting-
I need to do more to learn this. The question that you come up with is, what level of government is? You know, federalism is an important principle we can't lose sight of. What level of government is best? And it's probably going to be a multi-level approach that will take place. But I need to get more into this to give you a better coherent answer.
After the November election, people were suggesting that the Republican Party needed to look in a couple areas and become, more flexible. One was immigration, which Ernie answered you've been interested in. The other one is same-sex marriage. Several people are saying that the party needs to reconsider that issue. And speaking of charts, Nate Silver's put together his chart saying if trends move statistically in the same direction that they've been going the last 10 years, by 2016, every state except for the Deep South will support, a majority of people will support same-sex marriage. Do you think the Republican Party's out of touch with the country on that or not?
No, I don't think so. I think it's an issue that people feel passionately about on both sides of the issue. I believe that there are reasonable positions short of redefining marriage that can be accommodated. And I voted for ENDA. I think we've had that here since 82 when Lee Dreyfus signed that. I think there can be reasonable accommodations on affording rights and privileges to couples, which is what civil union laws get you, short of redefining marriage.
Speaking of Nate Silver,
I don't know, Nate. I mean,
in the days leading up to the election in
Okay.
November, his blog at the New York Times, as it turns out, accurately predicted what would happen.
yeah.
So 3-4 days out, it looked very unlikely that your ticket would win. Were you surprised by the result?
I
on
was.
election night? And why is that? Did you have other polling?
Yeah, we did. This is something we're gonna. This is one of Reince's jobs. Is our polling, and I'm told other Republican polling predicted we were going to win. Pre-Katrina, we were up 6 points in the Gallup and other public
Pre-Sandy?
polls.
Pre-Sandy.
Did I say pre-Sandy? Excuse me, pre-Sandy. Post-Sandy, that lead kind of evaporated, but we looked like we were coming back up. I think the big issue is the turnout assumptions. And all of our polling were more, I guess, conventional, based on a conventional wisdom. We had polled a clear turnout enthusiasm advantage. We won independents. We got high 90%, I don't know, was it 96, 97, 98% of Republicans, and we won independents. Usually you win an election when you do that. And so we won the categories we thought we were going to win, but we still lost the election. And you have to give credit to the Obama team for their absolute incredible turnout operation and the way they did their analytics and their turnout, where they basically wiped out the enthusiasm advantage we had going into the election. And pollers call it high propensity or low propensity voters. They rank these things from 1 to 10 and 8s to 10s and 1s to 3s. And without getting into all the details, they were able to get people to the polls who are low propensity voters. And that wiped out the advantage we had going into the election. And our polling didn't pick that up. Nobody's did. I mean, from what I can tell, on the Republican side. And so We knew it was going to be really close. We thought we were going to win, but we didn't, and those are the tougher kind of losses to have, the ones that you don't necessarily see coming.
So what did you learn personally from the experience?
I learned a lot. I feel I benefited from it. The one big regret I have is Mitt Romney's not president, because he's a very good man. He's a man of great intelligence, integrity, and character, and he really wanted to just fix the country's problems. And I was excited about the plans that we had put in place for the first couple of 100 days, which were to fix these problems. And I now see the trajectory of this country, which is, this isn't one of those elections where we're going to go slightly left of center or slightly right of center. This is an election where we were going this way or that way. And I'm not saying we were going to do some big rightward leech. We were going to do what we said we were going to do. But I think the outcome of this election is just enormous. And the consequences of it, we'll have to see. Divided government hopefully will bring it back toward the center. What I learned was there are a lot of people, millions of people who just are passionate about this country, passionate about the ideas of this country, and that's encouraging. We got to see a lot of parts of America we wouldn't have otherwise seen. My family enjoyed the experience. Security was a lot more than necessarily we expected, but great people. But it was definitely very whirlwind. But I learned it's a fantastic country that's worth fighting for, with millions of passionate people who care a lot about it.
So you ready to do it again?
Right.
We got a headline rating.
So only a
No,
couple
I don't.
years away.
Yeah, everybody says it. I mean, I'm a little. Aren't you guys a little tired of presidential politics? I kind of am. I mean,
No, not really.
really? Gosh, I am. This I see as my job. I represent the 1st District of Wisconsin. I'm the chairman of the Budget Committee. I see a real big problem right on our horizon, and I feel just morally obligated to focus on that. And then these other issues I've been talking about. I think I want to focus on poverty. I want to focus on making sure we get immigration fixed. I want to focus on these other issues that I think are in need of work.
On other elections, why do you think Tommy Thompson lost?
I haven't really given a lot of thought to that. I think it's unfortunate that he had a tough primary that cost his resources, and so there was, I don't know. I mean, I was a little busy, but there was that time period where Tammy had the airwaves and he didn't. How long was it?
It was a 2-week period.
Yeah, that was a pretty critical. He was dark, and you never want to go dark. So that's a tactical thing. I think the other thing is just the turnout. He got caught in the same thing we did, which is they beat us on turnout in critical swing areas, in critical areas. They turned out their voters in a better way in some areas than we did.
Well, in some respects, did Wisconsin change for him? I mean, he was so well known. But
I don't think so. I think
for 10, 12 years and then came back.
No, I don't see that. I just think these were circumstances outside of his control that he fell victim to.
You brushed off his question about running for president. But
That's right. I intentionally did. Are you going to bring that back up?
But I would, if you are going to run, or anybody running for the nomination in 2016, when would you need to be putting together things and start?
Dan, I don't know the answer to that.
You've seen it on the ground.
I have seen it on the ground, and I've seen what it takes and what it is and what it's like. So that's pretty clear to me.
It's starting earlier and earlier.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, I think. I actually don't like that fact that it starts earlier and earlier. I think it depends on the person. It depends on where you are with name ID. Where are you in fundraising? I mean, I think individual people have probably individual different timelines based upon where they are.
So you brushed my question.
Yeah. I honestly don't know, Dan, and I don't have a plan.
But we have to wrap it
figure this out
up.
for a while.
Will you run for re-election in Congress?
I just got started in this job, so I'm focusing on doing my job now.
Congressman Ryan, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.